Let us pray. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our King and to his government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. So may your kingdom come and your name be hallowed. Amen. Honorable members, I was deeply saddened to learn about Her late Majesty's passing. Our heartfelt condolences go out to the entire royal family. Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was the emblem of public devotion. As the longest reigning British monarch, she leaves behind a legacy of service through over 600 royal patronages across the Commonwealth, including 36 charitable organizations in Canada. For the vast majority of us, we have never known a life without Her late Majesty as monarch. Her example as a life of service to others and poised under unrelenting pressures may have even influenced some in this chamber to pursue a life of public service. As one reign succeeds another, we are witnessing a historical moment as a new sovereign takes his place as our king. For the moment, we mourn the loss of a beloved monarch and celebrate the life of a remarkable woman, a woman who, on her 21st birthday, addressed the Commonwealth and dedicated her life, quote, whether it be long or short, unquote, in service of others. May Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, rest in peace. I ask you to take a moment of silent reflection and prayer as we remember Her late Majesty. Rest eternal, grant unto Her late Majesty, O Lord, and let light perpetual shine upon her. Members, we will now be led in the singing of our national anthem, followed immediately by God Save the King.
Free.
The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to ask the Chamber for unanimous consent to waive Standing Order 7 in order to allow our Assembly, Alberta's Assembly, to proceed immediately to Government Motion 32, an address to His Majesty King Charles III in memory of our late Sovereign, Elizabeth II, in order to pay respects to her, Mr. Speaker.
Members, I will ask only one question. Is anyone opposed to providing unanimous consent? If so, indicate now. Unanimous consent is granted. Orders of the day.
Government motions. Motion number 32, Honourable Mr. Kenney.
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I move Government Motion 32, which reads that an humble address be presented to His Majesty the King as follows. We, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Legislative Assembly now assembled, wish to express the deep sympathy felt by this Assembly for the great sorrow which Your Majesty has sustained by the death of the late Queen, Your Majesty's mother. Extend to all the royal family the deep sympathy of this Assembly in their grief. Assure Your Majesty that Her late Majesty's unstinting dedication over a reign of 70 years to the service of our great province and its people, and to the service of the countries and peoples of the wider Commonwealth, will always be held in affectionate and grateful remembrance, and express to Your Majesty our loyalty to you and our conviction that you will strive to uphold the liberties and to promote the happiness of the people in all your realms now and in the years to come.
The Honourable, the Premier has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give thanks for the life and to mourn the death of our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth the Great. While her portrait gazes over our proceedings today, as it has done for decades in this place, it is difficult to conjure the words adequately to express the grief that so many of us suffer at her loss. I must say very personally that her death has hit me harder than I expected, as though I've lost a grandmother or a longtime friend. And so it is truly a serendipitous honor that my last speech in this place, as Her late Majesty's First Minister, is to honor her remarkable life and legacy. Dying in her 8th decade on the throne, the Queen was a constant and reassuring presence throughout our entire lives. Indeed, the reign of Elizabeth II as our head of state spanned 70 of the 117 years, or 61% of the time that Alberta has existed as a province, and nearly half of the history of the Dominion of Canada. Through all of those years, hundreds of members of this legislature swore an oath of allegiance to the Queen, to her heirs and forebears. Thousands of laws have been passed by this Assembly that were adopted by and with Her late Majesty's consent. Her Executive Council governed under her authority, and our courts dispensed justice in her name. Her first British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, was prophetic when he said upon the accession of the then 24-year-old Princess Elizabeth to the throne that it was the beginning of a new Elizabethan age. Mr. Speaker, that age has finally drawn to a close. For so many of us, it seemed as though it might go on forever. Such was her devotion to duty that she seemed utterly unstoppable. Indeed, when I first met the then Prince of Wales, and now King Charles, 25 years ago, I said to him, "Your Royal Highness, I very much look forward to the day that you will be the King of Canada." And he responded to me with a wry smile, "Well, with the way that my mother is carrying on, I doubt that day will ever arrive." Just consider this. The first British Prime Minister of her reign, Winston Churchill, was born in 1872. And her last Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, who was invited to form a government just 36 hours before her death, was born in 1972. Her first Canadian Prime Minister, the great Louis Saint Laurent, was born in 1882, and her last Canadian Prime Minister born in 1971. So her life bridged such vastly different worlds, from the Victorian to the postmodern, from the days of horse-drawn carriages to the space age. And yet she mustered the wisdom to navigate the century that incorporated exponentially more change than any other in human history. Through those tumultuous cultural, political, scientific, and social upheavals, she was the lodestar, the bedrock of our institutions, of our common life, and the guarantor that certain virtues and customs worthy of continuing would persist. She gave us that comfort and certainty not by wielding practical political power, but by her own constant example of duty, service, humility, dignity, and yes, faithfulness. Through her graceful example, she told us to honor and protect what the great poet T.S. Eliot called the permanent things. As the personification of the crown, she stayed true to her coronation oath and naturally revered tradition as the democracy of the dead, in the words of G.K. Chesterton. But she also understood that tradition must evolve because, as the composer Gustav Mahler said, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And so she led the modern evolution of the monarchy, preserving what was essential while adapting to change and new public expectations. Mr. Speaker, in losing Her Majesty, it also feels that we close the chapter on the greatest generation. The stoicism of our late Queen was characteristic of the generation that rose up from every corner of the British Empire to defend civilization from Nazi barbarism during the Second World War. Princess Elizabeth could have fled to the safety of Canada when Britain was under threat of invasion, or she could have secluded herself in the royal estates. But instead, she beseeched her father, King George VI, to be allowed to serve, becoming Second Subaltern Windsor of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. And there she demonstrated her famous practicality as an army truck mechanic, learning skills that held her in good stead for the rest of her life, particularly bombing around on Balmoral in her Land Rover. I don't believe, Mr. Speaker, that the Queen ever called herself a feminist, but she didn't need the label or a theory to break barriers and prove her ability in areas previously reserved to men. She demonstrated that, and her great boldness, when the late Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia visited the royal family at Balmoral. The Queen suggested that they go on a drive through the estate together. Prince Abdullah reluctantly agreed, only to find the Queen put on her wellies and jump in the driver's seat, bolting out of the yard at full speed, careening around tight corners and speeding down narrow country lanes while speaking excitedly and pointing out key features of the estate. Apparently, the prince became white-knuckled and terrified, and through his translator begged Her Majesty to slow down. Of course, in her own mischievous way, the Queen made a powerful statement for the women of Saudi Arabia who were prohibited from driving. Since her passing, Mr. Speaker, we have heard much about that dry sense of humor, which I observed firsthand during her last visit to Canada, during which I had the high honor of being her minister in attendance at various events. On one occasion, I accompanied Her Majesty and His Royal Highness to be honest, I'm sure her favorite Canadian event, the running of the Queen's Plate, the greatest thoroughbred race in North America. And she presented the award to the winner of the Great Queen's Plate, named after her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and then came back to the viewing stand, and she was scheduled to watch one more race and then depart for the Royal Canadian Air Force jet to take her back to London. But, Mr. Speaker, that one race turned into a second race, it turned into a third, and a fourth race, and now the royal party was running nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. And one could see Prince Philip getting a little agitated. And I observed as he approached Her Majesty and he said, "Ma'am, we are now 40 minutes late for the flight." And I heard her distinctly say, "Philip, I have the distinct impression that the aeroplane will wait for me." But beneath that wry exterior was a woman of great intelligence and substance. All of her prime ministers remarked at how astonishingly well-informed she was about matters ranging from the economy to global affairs. She was the Commonwealth's greatest diplomat. Former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once said, quotes, "I was astonished at Her Majesty's grasp of all the details sent in messages and telegrams." And Mr. Speaker, for those who work in Whitehall, ministers are often known not to return their red boxes, their ministerial homework, with the work completed. But Her Majesty, who was known as Reader Number One, always returned her work completed on time. She took her role in every respect seriously. Mr. Speaker, let it be said that one of Her late Majesty's greatest achievements was the creation and the preservation of the Commonwealth, this great family of nations, which has lived through many stresses and strains, incredibly diverse collection of nations which share a common history connected to Britain and the English language. Across the world was spread her territorial family, a group of wildly diverse nations, vast and tiny, rich and impoverished, republics and monarchies, that she charmed and cajoled and nudged to remember what bound them together and what together they might achieve. And we have her to thank for its vitality today. Mr. Speaker, the constant throughout the Queen's life was, of course, a profound and unshakable sense of duty. As she famously said on her 21st birthday to a global radio audience, as you cited earlier, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it." Later in life, Mr. Speaker, she said that, quotes, "Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret or retract one word of it." Mr. Speaker, that sense of duty continued until the very end, when she commissioned her 15th British Prime Minister to form a government while we now know that she was deathly ill, hours from her deathbed. Indeed, the only thing that could stop Queen Elizabeth II from performing her duty was death itself, which, as a woman of profound Christian faith, she undoubtedly embraced as the passage to her ultimate destiny, to be united with her Lord, the King of Kings. Mr. Speaker, we in Alberta have been blessed in so many ways. But one of those ways is to be the inheritors of the great traditions of Westminster parliamentary democracy and the constitutional monarchy, which she personified for most of our province's history. On her several visits to our province, she demonstrated a great love and admiration for this place and for its people, for its First Nations, for newcomers from every corner of the world. And Mr. Speaker, her name will live on. In this place, her name will live on forever in schools and streets, roadways and buildings, and indeed, Mount Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Elizabeth Range of our majestic Rocky Mountains. Mr. Speaker, as you know, many of the functions of the Legislative Assembly occur in what we have known since 1954 as the Federal Building, which was acquired by the Government of Alberta, refurbished, and is an important extension of the work that we do here. Your Honor will know that when it was commissioned, the 10th floor was named after the Windsor family, after Her late Majesty's family, and its various members. And so I believe it is fitting, Mr. Speaker, that we extend that recognition of her service to our province. And so in the weeks to come, that will be formally renamed the Queen Elizabeth II Building. Mr. Speaker, why do so many experience an unexpected grief at the loss of a woman that most people never met personally, who was perhaps a distant image on a coin or a stamp or in television reports? How can we explain the impact that her passing has had on so many here and around the world? The queues, miles long, for people to pay a brief moment of respect at her catafalque at Westminster Hall. Mr. Speaker, I think the answer is twofold. Firstly, people around the world have a sense of turning a chapter in history, of being part of history and observing her death. But also because we live in a world where there is, sadly, much darkness, where there is evil, violence, instability, exploitation, the denial of human dignity. We see it now in a spectacular way in Vladimir Putin's appalling invasion of Ukraine. And so, when we look at our late Queen, what we see is the counterpoint, the opposite, the contradiction to that darkness and division which characterizes too much of modern history. What we see in her is dignity, faithfulness, and yes, Mr. Speaker, goodness. We join with our fellow Albertans, Canadians, subjects and citizens of the Commonwealth spanning the globe, and countless others in paying tribute to a truly good, dutiful, and faithful woman. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the late Queen was a woman who held a quiet but deep Christian faith. And so I join with countless people here and around the world in praying for the repose of her soul and the consolation of her family. She would have meditated many times on the parable of the talents. So, I hope and believe that she will finally hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things." Enter into the joy of your Lord. Thank you, Your Majesty. May God save the King.
The Honourable, the Leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise on behalf of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition to remember and to commemorate the life of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. I offer my deepest condolences to King Charles, and the royal family for their loss, and to all Albertans who are mourning this loss. Elizabeth II is the only Queen of Canada many of us, including myself, have ever known. Her reign of more than 70 years is the longest of any British monarch, and it's extraordinary to reflect on the massive global changes that occurred over that time. When a 25-year-old Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1952, telephones were rotary dial, computers were the size of refrigerators, and no one had heard of Elvis Presley or the Beatles. She reigned through countless moments in world history, the moon landings, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the extraordinary rise of digital communications, just to name a few. In Canada, she oversaw pivotal moments, as many have already mentioned in talking about her over the last few days, such as the repatriation of the Constitution and the adoption of the Charter in 1982. And of course, as we all know, this effort also involves securing within that constitutional document provincial dominion over our natural resources. Something, of course, very important to Canada and very, very important to Albertans. Something that could only happen in a peaceful, democratic setting that encouraged thoughtful, open debate, negotiation, and resolution. And it was under her gaze that this example of positive political development was able to take place. So through these seismic changes, Queen Elizabeth remained a symbol of stability, of continuity, and liberal democracy for the United Kingdom, for Canada, and for the Commonwealth nations around the world. Now, we must also recognize, Mr. Speaker, that the British Crown can evoke some very different reactions from Indigenous people in our land who have been and continue to be subject to colonization and the consequences of colonization. And it is also can invoke different reactions from other citizens of the country with roots in jurisdictions that also struggled with the consequences of conflict with the Crown. And those who still endure the harms of colonialism will have a different view on the institutional monarchy itself. Those Canadians have a right to voice these perspectives. We must honor those perspectives. We must listen to those perspectives, because I believe as well that the example that Queen Elizabeth herself demonstrated is that that is exactly what she would do and what she would call on us to do. That being said, we are here to recognize and memorialize Queen Elizabeth herself and the personal attributes that allowed her to contribute to the well-being of our Commonwealth throughout the term of her reign. She made her first visit to Alberta before she became Queen in 1951, and she would visit 5 more times, most recently in 2005. Now, I don't have quite the level of personal stories that our Premier has, but I will say in 1978, she did come to Alberta and to Grand Prairie to turn the sod on the construction of the hospital that still bears her name there. I was fortunate enough to have dinner with her during that visit. Mind you, I was 14 at the time, and there were 500 of our closest friends and neighbors in the room, so I don't know that I made much of an impression on our head of state that evening. My mother and father, however, did get a chance to meet her properly. My dad used his audience to lobby, unsuccessfully, for her to visit our hometown of Fairview, which was celebrating its 50th anniversary that year. But it was honestly my mother who treasured that opportunity the most, up to her dying day. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why that was. Because if we examine Queen Elizabeth through my mother's eyes, you can understand the admiration that she invoked so broadly, not only in Canada and the Commonwealth, but around the world. My mother was born in the U.S., and she was involved in what some folks might today refer to as radical woke left activities. She traveled in the same circles as Abby Hoffman. She attended peace marches, and she traveled throughout the southern United States to register black voters before moving to Alberta in 1962. Later in life, while living in Alberta, she pursued a degree in liberation theology. She visited Nicaragua after the Sandinista Revolution and South Africa during apartheid, where she met Desmond Tutu. But notwithstanding all of that, she was 13 years old when she watched Princess Elizabeth ascend to become Queen of the entire Commonwealth. And for her generation, watching that and being nearly of the same age was a revelation. it captured her imagination, and I know this because she spoke to me about it a lot. And like so many other young women at the time, her admiration of the Queen never waned throughout the remainder of her life. As a woman coming of age in the late 50s and early 60s, Queen Elizabeth provided the strongest example of a woman leader to a generation of women who didn't really have much else to look for in the way of female Western democratic leaders at the time. She was so much an icon that my mother also tried very, very hard to emulate the Queen's fashion sense. Let me tell you, now there were some hats that I believe might well have worked well at Ascot or Queen's Plate. They didn't work so well on Main Street in Fairview. There was a little bit of explanation that I would periodically have to make to folks. But I tell you the story to illustrate the broad appeal that Queen Elizabeth had to so many, regardless not only of their politics, but of their country of origin. At the time of marrying my father, my mom couldn't maintain dual citizenship, so she happily became a Canadian citizen. She used to talk to me about that. She was a big political geek, and I was quite young, and she used to tell me how proud she was to be part of a constitutional monarchy. At the age of 7, I nodded my head and waited for her to move on to the next topic. But nonetheless, she would argue that in the U.S., the president was more distanced from the people because, in principle, in the absence of a monarchy in the U.S., it meant that the formality and the celebrity and the dignity of the role was attributed to the president, and therefore somehow removed them from the kind of democratic accessibility one would hope to see in their democratic leaders. And my mom believed very strongly that the presence of the monarchy in Canada inherently released politicians from that formality and the ceremony that might otherwise have distanced us from our constituents. Now, I think political scholars and monarchists and republicanists and others, constitutional scholars, will debate that point. But I just remember my mother believing it very strongly as part of her overall value that she tried to share with me and our family about her respect for the Queen. And what is true is there is no question at all that Queen Elizabeth ensured our democracy would rest on stability, on dignity, and on integrity, and the rule of law that not only her role represented, but her conduct within that role represented. Now, that was evident in her 1978 visit when the royal family opened Commonwealth Stadium and kicked off the games here in Edmonton. The Queen attended a banquet hosted by Premier Peter Lougheed where she gave a televised national address about the importance of a unified Canada. She said the following, quote, "Encouraged by a wise government both at the federal and provincial levels, Canadians have cherished their diversity. They exhibit a highly individualistic approach to life while at the same time adhering to the ideal of a firmly united people." And she went on to say, quote, "I'm delighted to find that the people of Alberta, in developing their enormous natural resources, are determined to remember that material strength does not solve all man's problems, and that ultimately it is the quality of life that we all live that matters. All this has been achieved in Alberta by people of many different ethnic origins working together. And it is in the interests of Albertans, like all Canadians, to continue to build a society where the individual can find full expression in an atmosphere of tolerance, cooperation, and harmony," end quote. And so here we are, 44 years later, continuing to practice and honor those Canadian traditions in this place. And of course, Canadian unity has been repeatedly tested, and when Elizabeth II was here in 1990, she acknowledged a, quote, "sense of anxiety about Canada's future," and spoke of a united Canada, quote, "which I trust I shall see in future years when I come again." She went on to say, quote, "I'm not just a fair weather friend, and I'm glad to be here at this sensitive time. The unity of the Canadian people and their will to live together will be tested in the months ahead. Knowing Canadians as well as I do," she said, "I cannot believe that they will not be able, after a period of calm reflection, to find a way through present difficulties." She was right about that, and I believe she's still right today. So in preparing to make this statement, I was also kind of pleased to stumble across an article written about the Queen's last visit to Alberta in 2005. Now, during this trip, Highway 2 became Queen Elizabeth II Highway, or the QE2 as we all refer to it, and the Provincial Museum of Alberta became the Royal Alberta Museum. She also made a trip to Jasper, visited Commonwealth Stadium, attended a centennial celebration at the Saddle Dome, and took a helicopter tour of the oil sands. But what caught my eye, and will make no surprise to folks here, was a story about a minor kerfuffle regarding invitations to dinner with the Queen. Apparently there was a misunderstanding about whether the opposition leader, Stephen Harper, was invited, and that led to a bit of a shake-up in the seating chart. Because who did Premier Ralph Klein find himself sitting next to? Well, none other than Jack Layton. And apparently, Premier Klein wasn't very happy about this at first. But wouldn't you know it, they found common ground and spent the evening discussing the sponsorship scandal. So we talk about Queen Elizabeth as a unifying force. And indeed, in that moment, she managed to get even Ralph Klein and Jack Layton to break bread together. During her visit, the Queen also addressed the Alberta legislature for the first time in the province's history. In her address in this very room, she left Albertans with this sound advice, and I quote, "During this visit, as we honor the spirit of those who built this great nation, it is timely to remind ourselves that we can indeed make a difference for those who will in turn come after us. If we strive in our own lives and in our own way to leave the world around us a little better than the way we have found it, and to maintain the highest standards in everything we do, we can legitimately take pride in our contribution." End quote. And I believe that all of us in this House today can agree that Queen Elizabeth was utterly tireless in holding herself to the high standards she described that day. These visits, they left a lasting legacy in our province and many memories for Albertans. Her presence can be felt and seen around the province, as the Premier has outlined. And looking back, these visits took place at pivotal times in our history. And while she avoided giving her opinion on political matters, she still had strong convictions, and people took notice when she did express an opinion. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney said Queen Elizabeth II was a, quote, behind-the-scenes force on ending apartheid. And here in Canada, she firmly believed in a united Canada. She has been described by those who knew her as compassionate, humble, and wise. During her visit, she left us with wise words about diversity, tolerance, cooperation, and national unity. These words are just as true today as they were then. These are themes that all members who have the privilege of sitting in this chamber and those who may sit here in the future would do well to remember. It's a reminder that there is more that unites us than divides us as Albertans and Canadians. The Queen was known for her dedication and her service to people. Indeed, her disciplined, diligent, careful, unwavering, unending focus on duty serves as the embodiment of what public service looks like. Some of us, on both sides of the aisle, have served in Her Majesty's government, and some of us, again on both sides of the aisle, have served in Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And that framing of the role of the opposition is an important reminder. However vehemently we disagree in this place, we are all loyal to Alberta, loyal to Canada, loyal to the democratic, legal, and political traditions which flow from the Crown. We should all follow the Queen's example, service and duty. These traditions have been a profound source of stability in Canada. And even when we have our differences, it's these democratic principles and respect for the rule of law that allow us to resolve those differences peacefully. For generations, Queen Elizabeth was a source of that kind of stability, sometimes in uncertain times. Her passing makes familiar things feel different. It changes the words of our national anthem. But the immediate and peaceful transfer of the crown to a new monarch should also remind us of the fundamental political stability that makes us Canadian, that makes us members of the Commonwealth. It is my honor to wish all the best to King Charles III on behalf of our caucus, His Majesty's loyal opposition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, Government Motion 32, a humble address to His Majesty the King. Are there others? The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the other speakers so far on Motion 32. It's with great humility and quite frankly sadness that I'm rising to address the passing of our Queen and wishing the best in optimism to our new King. I never met the Queen. I never saw her at a parade. Being a farm kid, it was pretty far off in distance. But my grandmother, she was the daughter of a British officer from the British Expeditionary Force. And Grandma always had a corner of the house that was kind of dedicated to the Queen, the royalty, and such. Everything that was related to what happened with the Queen and the family and how it was relevant to Canada. And I think it's with that some of those inherent things have stuck with us over the years as, humble beginnings and farm kids and otherwise. And looking, this is hitting me kind of hard, as if my own grandmother passed, and I think that's kind of a surprise for a bunch of us of how much this lady actually meant to all of us here. Being 25 years old and she stepped into that position and carried that role with such dignity and grace for over 70 years is outstanding. Folks in my generation have never known another sovereign other than the Queen. And I think it's with that part of that duty and loyalty that there was a couple of us in my family. My brother, my youngest brother, he signed up to be part of the Royal Naval Reserve. Was because of it. I got to swear an oath as an MLA. I don't have a ton of interactions with that, but what I did was I reached out to folks in my community, and I couldn't imagine, and seeing on social how many stories came forward and how much of an impact that she really had. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to retell a few of those. So one is Edward Gallagher. He's a former military officer, and he wanted to send a story and a wishes to the King on behalf of himself and his family. And it was on March 8th, 1983. He was just shy of his 21st birthday, and he was attending the Royal Roads Military College. And he actually commanded an honor guard for Her Majesty the Queen, and he had tea with her. He says the visit lasted for 50 minutes in total, but he remembered like it had happened yesterday. And hers was a life of service unmatched. Ed also shared a number of photos with us as well, and it had a profound effect on this gentleman for the rest of his life of service in our community. Retired Sergeant Cole Rosentrauter, retired Canadian Airborne. When I asked him if any thoughts as well, and he'd served in Afghanistan, he says a lifetime of service is what he offered to the Queen, and he would offer it again without a second thought. He says, I cannot lead you in a battle, I cannot give you laws to administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and all the peoples of our brotherhoods of our nations. Retired Master Sniper, Canadian Pathfinder Airborne Sergeant Ben Click. As a monarch, the Queen was an eternal constant, a reminder that our loyalty is not to the transient politicians or temporary administrations, but to the nation, the people, and their ideals. As a person, she was a living embodiment of selfless service and a standard that we all aspire to. Those who met the Queen may say that when you meet people, you get a sense of how important they are. When you met Her Majesty, she made you feel how important you were. This is the leadership, and we'll miss her. Retired Lance Corporal Glenn Brooks from Australian Airborne. It's times like these that the multitude of humble servants like myself, whom serve that wonderful monarch, stand by silent and respectful. I have no words that could add weight to her passing of our loss. I appreciate the offer. My own way, I met with her for a few seconds in Sierra Leone in 1994. Touched me forever and made me realize who I was and what I was doing and what my duty was. Master Corporal Combat Engineer Chance Burrows. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth was always a constant in our lives. Her face was adorned on our money, her photo in every school, in every office, ever present, watching over us. As a picture of service and duty that reminded us to hold ourselves to a higher standard. When I first joined the military, I swore in her service, I pledged my allegiance to her. Once in the military, her presence was felt, even without ever having her being there. Our insignia, the Queen's crown, they lived by the Q&Rs, the Queen's regulations and orders. Even the grass was off duty because it was the Queen's. Her presence was ever there. With her loss, we've reached an end of an era, one in which she presides over great changes and upheaval. As the times changed, the technology changed, she showed us that change was not a bad thing, but we should always hold the touchstone that made us who we are. We see only for we do as we stand on the shoulders of giants. She was one of those giants. Thank you, Your Majesty, for always being there. Another lady that I know, she was an officer in the Canadian Navy, actually, and she also swore 2 oaths, one as a servant to the people of the province. And in her words, it was a service to It was her honor to service in both. And what she wrote was, Queen Elizabeth II personified the duty of selfless service. Her steadfast devotion to service was a living embodiment of what it means to sacrifice for yourself for the good of others. Her Majesty was once serving member in the armed forces herself, having served in the auxiliary territorial services during the Second World War. True leadership is not just shown in words, but by actions. In being unshakable in her duty, the loyalty, and the dedication of those who selflessly served with honor. Her Majesty the Queen was the daughter of a Royal Naval Officer. She married a Royal Naval Officer, and the two children had a very long naval career. So you can tell there's a propensity to naval and an affinity from Andrea. Her Majesty the Queen was the daughter of a Royal Naval Officer, said that one. Having served in the Aberdeenshire with Her Majesty and the royal family, spent most of the portion of their time every year. Many who served there felt more personal connection with Queen Elizabeth II. Her Majesty showed an unwavering devotion to the armed forces, members of remarkable care and commitment to our families. She was the armed forces' honorary mother and grandmother, commanded a unique respect through her wisdom, compassion, and unimpeachable example. There's more here, but obviously with respect to others that have things to say, I'm going to wrap this one a little bit shorter. So Andrea Prenzold thanks the Queen for her service. She says, "Thank you for your 70 years of service, ma'am. It was an honor to have served you." And to paraphrase a traditional goodbye of the Royal Navy, "Fair winds and following seas, weary traveler, your duty is done." Lay down your heart and rest. God save our Queen, and long live the King.
The honourable member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to rise today to commemorate the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. During my first term as MLA, I had the pleasure of serving in the role of the Government of Alberta's liaison to the Canadian Armed Forces, and now act as His Majesty's loyal opposition liaison to the Canadian Armed Forces. As such, the relationship between the Crown and the military holds a special place in my heart. Queen Elizabeth's relationship with the military was expansive and ever-changing, yet still retaining a level of warmth and care for those who served. Much of this is due to the times in which she lived and the impact on her as a young girl. The Queen came of age during World War II. For so many at the time, it would have been shocking for young women to go and train as mechanics and drivers, and yet that is exactly what she did. In 1945, at the age of 19, Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army, and became the first female member of the royal family to actively serve in the military. She was also the last surviving head of state to have served during the Second World War. Upon becoming the sovereign, she developed and maintained a meaningful relationship with the Canadian military, many of whom served in the Queen's Guard. Recently, members of the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery United Kingdom Public Duties Contingent provided their public duties for a month in 2021 as the Queen's Guard at the 4 royal residences and important locations in the London district, including Buckingham Palace and the Tower of London. Honouring our local talent for the multiple mount and dismount ceremonies, the Queen's Guard was accompanied by the 36-person Royal Canadian Artillery Band based here in Edmonton. As Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces, Her Majesty sought to comfort and motivate military personnel at challenging times. In a particularly thoughtful gesture, Queen Elizabeth also invited the 20th Field Regiment of the Canadian Royal Artillery to Edinburgh in honour of its 100th anniversary. Today, that regiment consists of the 61st Field Battery stationed in Edmonton and the 78th Field Battery based out of Red Deer, and is an active reserve unit in Alberta and serves as the ceremonial salute regiment for the province. It was deeply important to her to provide comfort and support when remembering those who had been deployed away from their families, a matter close to her heart as a military spouse herself, and with many of her children and grandchildren having served, most particularly Prince Harry in Afghanistan. The Queen supported veterans of the armed forces through her many patronages, including lending her support to grandson Harry's creation of the Invictus Games, an international multi-sport event held for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women, both serving and veterans. In fact, she even participated in a skit, joining Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, in a response to a challenge issued by the Obamas in relation to the Invictus Games, a video that went viral and continues to be used in the form of GIFs, clips, and memes today. And is this level of warmth and kindness something rarely attributed to this particular monarch that allowed her to use her love and connections with military persons for public good by giving back to those people she so respected and ensuring all knew they were cherished by not only herself, but by the monarchy itself. As the NDP critic for culture, I cannot help but admire the Queen's dedication and contribution to sports and culture in Alberta. In 1951, while still Princess Elizabeth, she made her first visit to Alberta and watched a CFL game where Edmonton beat Winnipeg in the Western semifinal. Calgarians were so excited for her visit, the Calgary Stampede put on a special fall edition of the show. It must have been a success, as she would go on to visit 3 more Stampedes over the decades. In 1978, Queen Elizabeth opened and attended the Commonwealth Games in Edmonton, a monumental event that included building the brand new Commonwealth Stadium. Opening sporting events in Canada became somewhat of a tradition for the Queen. She opened the Olympic Games in Montreal in 1976, the year that I was born, and officiated at the opening Commonwealth Games in Edmonton and then in Victoria in 1994, which is the year my oldest was born. The Queen also opened the 2012 Summer Olympics and Paralympics in London, making her the first head of state to open 2 Olympic Games in 2 countries. An avid equestrian and breeder of horses, she visited Spruce Meadows and inaugurated the yearly Queen Elizabeth II Cup. Her Majesty also opened the Museum of the Regiments at Canadian Forces Base Calgary and visited the Provincial Museum of Alberta when it was renamed in her honor to the Royal Alberta Museum. In addition to her love of sports, the Queen actively participated in philanthropic efforts, and she left a legacy among her family to do the same. She was patron of more than 600 organizations and charities and helped raise over £1.4 billion for her patronage during her reign. She sought to bring people together through sport, culture, and philanthropy. So too did she encourage the values by which she lived on the world stage. In speaking to the United Nations, she stated, and I quote, "Over the years, I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together. We all must take these words to heart and strive as leaders to work together for the benefit of the people we serve. Rest in peace, Your Majesty. God save the King."
The honourable member for Cardston-Siksika.
Grief and gratitude. That is what fills my heart today. Grief for the loss of our Queen Elizabeth II, but gratitude for her lifetime of service. Grief for the royal family as they have lost a valued family member and matriarch, but gratitude for her work on behalf of countless families around the world outside the walls of her own home. Grief that we may no longer know her renowned compassion and good humor. But gratitude for the example she set as a world leader in the time she spent through her 70-year reign as Queen, visiting cities around the globe. Edmonton, Alberta is one such city. In 1978, Queen Elizabeth visited Edmonton to open the Commonwealth Games. It was her 3rd trip to our capital city, and her time spent in Edmonton is well documented. She attended a banquet hosted by Premier Lougheed at the time and visited several other landmarks during her stay. But this was a unique visit because the mayor of Edmonton at the time was Cease Purvis, my wife's maternal grandfather. So I asked him, what was she like? And this is what he had to say. The Queen is only 5'4" tall, but when she entered her room, her personality and presence commanded the attention and respect of everyone present. She was reserved, but once she got more comfortable, she would show you her tremendous sense of humor. During her stay, she kept a strict timeline and wait for no one. On one instance, she was at an event with then Premier Lougheed. At one moment, he got distracted speaking with someone else, and instead of waiting for him, the Queen left him behind. On another instance, while walking through the massive crowds of people as she toured Edmonton City Centre with then Mayor Purvis, her husband, Prince Philip, was lagging behind. He was zigzagging back and forth through the crowd, talking with people as he could. And he did that so much so that the Queen had to turn around finally, and she snapped, "Philip, stop dawdling." But the compassionate side of the Queen, which is one of her most notable traits, was also on display one evening at a dinner at Government House, hosted by then Premier Lougheed, and with Mayor Purvis. As the dinner was about to begin inside the building, a large crowd of people had formed outside the building. And she had no intention of going outside. But Mayor Purvis and Premier Lougheed asked and tried to convince the Queen to go out on the balcony for a moment, and she did. She went outside and she waved, and the crowd below was delighted. As a politician, I have learned that some of the smallest things we do can have the largest impact. That is no different for a monarch. So today, we grieve the loss of Queen Elizabeth II. But we are grateful for her life of service and the impact she had on the world. May she rest in peace. God save the King.
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Immigration and Multiculturalism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is a solemn day in Alberta as we recognize the passing of Her Majesty, the Queen, and pay tribute to her life in the Alberta Legislature. I am honored to rise and speak as the Associate Minister of Immigration and Multiculturalism, as well as the MLA for Calgary North, offering condolences on behalf of my constituents. Queen Elizabeth II's reign was the longest of any other British monarch in all of history. For most people throughout the world, she is the only monarch they have ever known. Mr. Speaker, she has been the bedrock upon which governments of Alberta and Canada have relied on for the past 70 years. As elected officials, we have had the honor and responsibility of governing under the authority, and now we have that same authority and responsibility under the authority of King Charles III. And as every bill from this legislature until this date became an act in Her late Majesty's name through royal assent by the Lieutenant Governor, future bills will now become acts through His Majesty's name. Perhaps even more importantly than the Crown's link to our legislature is the Crown's work in society, Mr. Speaker. The Queen was an incredible example of selfless service, especially through her charitable work. She was the patron of 600 charities throughout the world, and when you include her family, almost 3,000 charities worldwide. Her favorite charities were those that focused on community and civic issues, closely followed by her support for education and training causes. As the former Executive Director of England's Charities Aid Foundation, John Lowe said, and I quote, "She has done more for charities over the past 60 years than any other monarch throughout the world," unquote. Prior to my election, I could have never predicted, Mr. Speaker, the demands of serving in the public eye and representing a constituency. This has been the most demanding job of my life beyond anything I experienced in the private sector, including charitable work, but it is one that I am honored to be doing. Despite my experience, I cannot imagine the demands of the Queen faced overseeing England and the many other countries in the Commonwealth. Between the demands of her family, her country, her ceremonial roles, her charitable work, and her Commonwealth tours, I am not certain anyone could maintain the same level of calm under that amount of pressure. As we reflect upon the Queen's life here in this house today, I cannot help but feel gratitude for the example of leadership she has set. May she always be remembered for her unparalleled service to Canada and to the world. In his inaugural speech, King Charles III said, and I quote, "As the Queen herself did with such unswerving devotion, I too now solemnly pledge myself throughout the remaining time God grants me to uphold the constitutional principle at the heart of our nation. And wherever you may live in the United Kingdom or in the realms of territories across the world, and whatever may be your background or beliefs, I shall endeavor to serve you with loyalty, respect, and love, as I have throughout my life," end of quote. In the same way that both Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and His Majesty King Charles III committed to a life of selfless service, let us do our work as legislators and government in the same way. I will always be grateful for her life of service and now the service of King Charles III. May God save the King. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Government Motion 38, the Honourable Member for Calgary McCall-Boular.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to rise to join the Premier, the Leader of the Official Opposition, and my legislative colleagues in commemorating the life and reign of Queen Elizabeth II. As the most well-traveled head of state, the Queen made hundreds of state visits, including being the first reigning monarch to visit Australia and New Zealand. She was also the first British monarch to visit the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Ireland. Her reign covered a time period of constant change for the monarchy, with many countries gaining independence and self-government. I represent a very diverse riding, and I have many constituents from Southeast Asian background, and in particular from the subcontinent where the British Empire once extended. As well, having constituents who have served in British military. Many of these communities and constituents have strong opinions around colonization, on their relationship with the Crown, and they have voiced their feelings, but I will leave that for another day. Today, we gather to recognize the life of service lived by Queen Elizabeth II. Today, we were all reminded of the words she spoke on her 21st birthday, making a commitment to the British people, and I quote, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." And a long and devoted life it was. During her long reign, Queen Elizabeth II remained a symbol of stability, continuity, dedicating her life to those people whose life were touched by the monarchy. This includes the complex and unique relationships found between the Crown and Indigenous people. As Albertans, as treaty people, we live here because the Crown entered into these relationships with the Indigenous person for whom these lands were home. When I was practicing Indigenous law, the concept of honor of Crown regarding treaties was of vital importance. In all its dealing with Indigenous people, from the assertion of sovereignty to the resolution of claims and the implementation of treaties, the Crown must act honorably. And so as the foundation of the relationship between the Crown and the Indigenous people, and in order to honor the Crown, Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III, we must ensure treaty obligations are fulfilled as intended. We are all treaty people, and for those who live here, to those who represent the signatories of the treaties. So as we recognize and pay respect to Queen Elizabeth II and her role as monarch, we must also acknowledge the need for reconciliation and the significant work we have yet to do. I offer my deepest condolences to King Charles and the British people and all those who are mourning the loss of Queen. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I see the member for Grand Prairie Wapiti.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my humble honor today to stand in the legislature and pay tribute to the remarkable life of Queen Elizabeth II. Our late monarch inspired the world with her strength, her poise, and grace, and the deep abiding sense of purpose that she carried throughout her life. Hers was a life of unwavering service to country, the Commonwealth, and her people. That steadfast purpose was a constant throughout her 70-year reign, despite immense technological, geopolitical, and societal change. During World War II, she gave her first public address to boost morale and served as an active member of the armed forces, where she trained and worked as a mechanic. At the age of 25, she became queen, and in front of 20 million people worldwide, publicly devoted her life wholly to duty and service to her country. Not a ceremonial post, but a calling, a vocation that she carried out with humility and dedication. The Queen's annual Christmas message was an encouragement to millions each year. For 69 of her 70 years as sovereign, she met people in their homes, pulling back the curtain on her public life and sharing a deeply personal piece of herself, her family, and her faith. 2 years ago, during a time of great fear and grief, she gave her first ever Easter address, speaking a much-needed message of hope and the light of Christ over a troubled world. And just 2 days before her passing, she personally met and appointed Britain's newest Prime Minister, still honoring her vow and discharging the duties of her office. Her dedication to family and country, the Commonwealth, and to people around the world exemplified service above self and inspired that in others. There may not be a public figure in my lifetime to whom these words apply more. From the Gospel of Matthew, well done, good and faithful servant.
The honourable member for Peace River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise today as someone who has been the subject of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II his entire life. I think that's true for the vast majority of citizens in Alberta and across the Commonwealth. And I'm also proud to rise today as someone who is subject of Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada. This has been her title in Canada since 1953, when the government of Canada changed her title to that. I think it's very important for us to recognize today that she is, has been the Queen of Canada, and King Charles is now the King of Canada. A separate title. We are not just subjects of the United Kingdom, but our own proper monarchy, of which we have a direct connection to. Now, I'm not a royal watcher, admittedly, Mr. Speaker. I don't follow the tabloids. I cannot name the entire royal family. There are many, many reasons that across the entire Commonwealth there are monarchists. There are many, many reasons why we appreciate Her Majesty the Queen. And for me, it's a cultural connection to the institution of the monarchy. It's a connection to tradition, particularly the institution of the monarchy. But I must say, as Canadian public commentator Ben Woodfindon said publicly recently, I was surprised by how much it affected me when I learned of her passing. Of course, many of us knew and expected this to come soon, 96 years old. But still, it hit me hard. In many ways, she was a silent grandmother there for so many of us throughout so many of these important experiences that Canada went through. Referendum debates on separation for Quebec, amendments to our Constitution, visits to Alberta, that naming of the Commonwealth Stadium. These were important parts of our public life that we lived together. And the Queen was always a part of it, not just as the monarchist, not just as a monarch there who was carrying on an institution that goes back over 1,000 years, but as somebody that we felt like we knew. Her Christmas addresses are what hit me every year. I appreciate so deeply that message. I didn't when I was younger, but as I got older, I came to very much appreciate it. And there's something to be said about the fact that she's a unifying figure from an institution of our past. Not the idea of hope in the future, what we will be together later on. These are good things to be unified around. But it's from the depths of our history, the very, very deepest part of who we are in Western civilization. That's what unites us. That's rare, Mr. Speaker, and something I think we should be celebrating in her life. In the 70 years of her reign, she was always a unifier. Stories we heard from both our Premier and the Leader of the official opposition, celebrating these moments of unity together, coming together in our public life again, through the monarch. I think this is important. I think that institutions, by definition, are formative, Mr. Speaker. They form people who go through them. It's not just people that they form, Mr. Speaker. They form our society. They form us as a people altogether. And that is what the monarchy has done to Canada. In her history, from the very beginning, even before her formation as a dominion in 1867, it was the monarchy that formed us, that made us unique in North America. We're not American, happily so. We are Canadian, proudly a part of the Commonwealth, previously subjects of the British Empire. Now proud sovereign citizens, loyal to Her Majesty the Queen, both in government and opposition. This is formative, Mr. Speaker. But there are few monarchs in history that are able to say they formed the monarchy itself. In her reign in Alberta and in Canada and the United Kingdom and the entire Commonwealth, she shaped what that institution is to us in our eyes. I mean, we were communicating in telegraphs very often at the time that she ascended to the throne. She's been the monarch since 1952 in February, when she, took over because her father passed away. And in her reign, we've heard a lot of the history that has happened throughout, the great moments of, parliamentary debate and prime-ministerial interactions. But in my constituency here in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, in 1950, all the way through until the winter of 1951, Alberta, and my constituency in particular, went through the greatest forest fire in Canadian history, even to this day. 3 million acres burnt down, Mr. Speaker, the Chinchaga fire. After that fire, as it was extinguished in the winter of 1951, Queen Elizabeth became the Queen, rose to replace her father in February 9th of 1952. In that entire time, silently growing in the forests of northern Alberta, along with Her Majesty the Queen, along with our province, have been the trees, this forest that continues to grow. I can think of no better analogy and common one-to-one with this organic growth continuing up, sustaining us in the north for sure in our economy, providing for us warmth, because there were still people breaking land and burning wood stoves for many, many years during her reign, as that forest supplied for us resources we needed. A part of who we are, the very environment in which we lived every day, were these trees that grew up along with Her Majesty the Queen, along with us. It's not just my life that has been lived. My father, born in 1950, his entire memorable life has been under Her Majesty the Queen. I'm told that my grandmother on my father's side met Her Majesty the Queen when she came to Alberta, visited her long-term care facility, old folks' home they used to call it, when Her Majesty was here. Of course, that is the one interaction my family had with her, in Her Majesty's service to those who built our province and came before us. That seems so fitting, doesn't it? it seems so right that the one interaction that I have of any kind of grasp at some sort of tangible connection to her is through her honoring my grandmother because of what she did before. She could have been hanging out with prime ministers, but no, she was in the forests. She was hanging out with the common people in service of them all. Those stories are so common. We hear them on the news today. It seems like 24 newscasts are stories of people with these. And there are so many of them because she did it every single day of her life in service. And she formed us in the institution of the monarchy. She formed us as a people in her small way. I'm grateful to her for that. And I want to end in a prayer that we have all uttered so many times we forgot that it was a prayer. But I think we should all mean it very seriously today when we say it. God save the Queen. God save her soul, and God save the King. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Banff Kananaskis.
Mr. Speaker, it is with grief and sadness that I rise today to speak to the life and the legacy of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. While this opportunity may be one of the greatest in my career in this House, Mr. Speaker, it is also one of the most difficult. For what can one individual of this chamber say to pay the proper respect to the woman who so dutifully served us for 70 years of her 96-year life? Never in our past has there been, nor in our future will there ever be anyone like our Queen. Ascending to the throne at just age 25, having never been intended for it, she grew to become the longest-serving monarch in our Commonwealth and the longest-serving female head of state in world history. But she also grew to become my personal hero. Her photo hangs in my house, her portrait in my office, reminding me daily of the leader that I and every member of this chamber could only ever aspire to be. In her life, Queen Elizabeth served as a mechanic in the World War. She studied constitutional law, reigned over 15 British prime ministers, addressed the U.S. Congress, and remains the first and only monarch to ever do so. She traveled tens of thousands of kilometers for duty, drove the Saudi Arabian king around Britain at a time when it was still a punishable offense for women to so much as drive back in their home country. She participated in high-level tactical and political conversations with some of the most iconic leaders of our lifetime. She held over 50 ranks in the British military, gave assent to over 4,000 British Acts of Parliament, and served as a constant beacon of grace, joy, goodness, and civility around the world. In present-day context, much of this may seem ordinary, but in the context of a young woman thrust into public service at such a young age and in the mid-1900s, it is extraordinary. She was extraordinary, Mr. Speaker. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth's smile warmed our hearts. Her compassion touched our homes. Her words gave hope to even the darkest of situations. And her elegance gave a generation of young girls a standard to look up to. She brought the crown out of Buckingham Palace and into our living rooms and connected citizens, millions of citizens around the world in a way that only she could. So many of us, myself included, and many that we've heard in the House today, felt as though we knew her, as though we had a personal, albeit undeserving, relationship with her. Known for her wit and for always being one of the most well-researched and well-educated conversationalists in the room, Queen Elizabeth II grew to become not simply our figurehead, but our head of state, and not just a title that she was bestowed upon, but one that she earned. Over her 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II upheld the crown uncompromisingly, always putting the institution, our values, our traditions, our customs, and the preservation of her way of life ahead of herself and her family, no matter the personal cost. Duty was the highest priority in her life, second only to her love of Jesus Christ. And that she met with Britain's new Prime Minister in the final 48 hours of her life is the most beautiful and perfect exemplification of her constant, lifelong, unwavering commitment to the higher purpose for which she was called. Having such a figure of grace and stability as our sovereign is something that many of us as Canadians may have taken for granted over the years. The beauty of the institution that is the Crown is that our people and our democratic institutions are silently bound by a respect for our history, a loyalty to our nation, and a duty to uphold a common foundation of morality. The Crown is not just the head of state. It is synonymously the head of church, which, although largely symbolic to this day, quietly instills in our governments, our justice system, and us a basic set of principles that are not often so found in the American Republic, which is guided by politics and populism of the day. The Crown transcends politics, allowing us quietly, perhaps even subconsciously, the freedom to govern ourselves by justice and virtue, rather than by public approval. We may not always realize it, but under Queen Elizabeth II's grace and discipline, the Crown profoundly bound us to one another through a love and a recognition for who we are and where we come from. Her Majesty's passing is now an opportunity for us to reflect not only on the woman who was, but on the importance of renewing our respect for the unifying influence of the institution that gave our country life. While the face of the monarchy has changed, the tenets of what it represents have not. My mother and I recently went to Britain in June to celebrate Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee, her 70th anniversary on the throne. We woke up at 4 a.m. to camp out at the parade route. We joined the thousands of people in the streets to watch the air flyby. And we attended her famous horse derby. And at the time, it seemed like a moment in history that we went to celebrate and be a part of. But looking back, it almost feels serendipitous that we chose to be there that day. Mr. Speaker, it's with immense sadness that we say goodbye to Queen Elizabeth II. Our world will unquestionably never be the same because of her, but it is also unquestionably a much better place because of her. Upon her visit to Alberta in 2005, while addressing this chamber, Queen Elizabeth referred to our province as a land where freedom reigned and where great opportunities lied ahead. Well, Mr. Speaker, I haven't been to heaven myself, but I certainly hope that after all she sacrificed and gave this world and our Commonwealth for 70 long, dutiful years, that she can now say those very same things about her forever home. During that same visit, she stated that she wished for the Crown in Canada to represent everything that is best and most admired in the Canadian ideal. Quote, "I will continue to do my best to make it so during my lifetime," she iterated. Your Majesty, you've done that and so much more. God save the Queen and long live the King.
The Honourable Member for Chestermere Strathmore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and honourable members. I'm truly humbled, and it is such a privilege to be able to speak today to honour Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Did you know that she visited Canada most out of all of the Commonwealth countries, 22 times? And I would like to just take a moment to thank both our Premier and the Leader of the Opposition for their wonderful speeches and stories. It's really what regular folks like me want to hear and love to hear those stories and the influences and impacts of those who are actually fortunate enough to have met her, and I really believe it brings her closer to all of us. She was also extremely committed to reconciliation, and she honored the painful history of our First Peoples and what they endured. And she spoke quite often about the work that remained to heal. I rise today, like so many other of my colleagues, to honor the legacy of our departed Sovereign Queen Elizabeth II. And up until last week, and others have said this, but I think it bears repeating, the Queen Elizabeth was the only sovereign that many Albertans and Canadians had ever known. And she had been at the center of the post-war world, in a constant government, and in a culture for an entire human lifetime. And that consistency is something that is likely needed more now than at any point during her long reign. A steady hand, a kind word, a commitment of decency and dignity and decorum in a world like it seems like it's coming undone. We know that Her Majesty provided all of us with an example of a life of service and a profound commitment to our institutions. And up until her final days, she fulfilled her responsibilities, including free, fair, and democracy. I, for one, am so honored to be able to honor that legacy and show everyday Albertans and Canadians and globally that our government and its institutions are worthy of this respect, because they put the people ahead of themselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and fellow members, and to the people of Alberta for the time to honor the legacy of what, for me, one of the most important leaders of our last century. And I would just like to end with a quote. When Queen Elizabeth began her last visit to Canada, she talked of coming home. Of course, she said that in New Zealand and Australia and many other places as well. She said, "Canadians have, by their own endeavors, built a country and a society which is widely admired across the world. I am fortunate to have been witness to many of the developments and the accomplishments of a modern Canada. And then she said this when she arrived in Halifax in 2010. As Queen of Canada for nearly 6 decades, my pride in this country remains undimmed. Thank you again for your welcome. It is very good to be home. May she rest in peace. God save the King.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Northeast, followed by the Honourable Member for Camrose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm greatly honored to rise today to speak on this day of remembrance. Today, I wish to pay homage to Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. God rest her soul. Her late Majesty was an unwavering presence in our lives for as long as many of us have been alive. She reigned with gracious glory for over 70 years, and it is for that very reason that her leadership and dedication to the Commonwealth will be dearly missed. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has helped shape our history in many ways, from her service in the armed forces in World War II to her unprecedented dedication to humanitarian efforts across the globe. Her Majesty was indeed a queen that loved to serve people. Throughout her life, Queen Elizabeth II was involved in over 600 nonprofit organizations across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. From the British Red Cross to the Royal College of Nursing, much of her humanitarian work centered around helping people around the world and bettering the ability for healthcare workers to provide such essential services. It is estimated that the Queen raised over $2 billion in humanitarian efforts over her course as head of state. This would make her the most charitable and influential monarch to raise money for nonprofits in the history of the monarchy. Her late Majesty's dedication to charity work did not only assist millions of people from across the globe, but also changed the narrative of what a monarch should be. In a 2012 interview with The Guardian, Chief Executive of the CAF, John Lowe, summed up the Queen's charitable work by stating that Her Majesty's work has set an example for all of us. By giving time and money to people in need, she proved herself to be more than just a monarch, but a true leader. Just recently, Her Majesty donated substantial relief to the Disasters Emergency Committee. That funding directly supported Ukrainian refugees suffering from brutal attacks by Putin's war machine. Throughout her life, she also contributed to other disaster relief efforts. Her Majesty donated to the 2015 Nepal earthquake relief, providing funding for the 2014 Ebola crisis and relief efforts for the 2019 Idai cyclone. It is clear that the Queen's gracious and giving spirit helps so many people across the world. Mr. Speaker, as elected officials who stand here to serve Albertans, she has set an admirable example for all of us. No matter on what side of the chamber you stand, we are all here to represent our constituents and work towards better communities and lives for all. Queen Elizabeth's presence and devotion to the public service will be dearly missed. So now it is up to all of us to carry the torch into the future. May we all learn from her actions and may we all follow in her footsteps. She was a true trailblazer for the monarchy, and her spirit of giving back will never be forgotten. While we mourn the loss of our Queen today, let us also celebrate her life, love, and dedication to the Commonwealth. May God rest her soul, and may God save the King. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Camrose, followed by the Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, in great sadness, we gather here to extend our sincerest condolences and reflect on Her late Majesty's extraordinary life and reign. This is a period of mourning for the people of Canada, the Commonwealth, and the world. Earlier this year, I had the fortune to observe a momentous occasion, Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee, which marked her 70 years of faithful service, the longest of any British monarch in history. Her unwavering fidelity and devotion to her country and the Commonwealth was acknowledged worldwide. Over the course of 70 remarkable years, she presented herself with timeless decency, integrity, and grace. Her late Majesty was a beacon of stability and leadership as she dedicated a lifetime of full-hearted duty. Her late Majesty was an exceptional woman whose achievements and milestones serve as an inspiration to women across the globe. At the young age of 25, she became only the 6th woman in British history to ascend to the throne. She has since been a driving force and most of the influential women in the world. She dedicated selfless service to the military and trained alongside other women in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Her wisdom and composure have contributed to her respected, admired, and widely esteemed legacy around the world. When I was only 6 years old, I wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth. As a little girl, I was captivated by Her Majesty's grace and poise. To this day, I can still remember the excitement and surprise I felt when I opened a letter from the lady in waiting. I was over the moon. It is a memory I have and will continue to cherish, look back on fondly. Throughout her 70-year reign, Her late Majesty has been an inspirational figure to many Albertans and Canadians such as myself. Queen Elizabeth II has always kept Canada close to her heart. From 1952 to 1922, the Queen made 22 official visits to Canada, where she made sure to visit every province, territory, and coast of our vast nation. Alberta was honored with 6 visits from Her late Majesty throughout her life. She toured Edmonton, Calgary, Banff, and Lake Louise, leaving Albertans with lasting memories. She was an exemplary woman who has been with us through many hardships and exhibited care and compassion when the world needed it most. For many people, she was an anchor of stability and hope and faith during unprecedented times. Her life of public service had a profound impact on a global scale, and she has touched the lives of millions. She will always be remembered for her commitment and dedication to her duty and her people. Her legacy will live on, and she will continue to be a role model for many generations to come. It has truly been an honor to have taken my oath to the Queen and have had the privilege to serve Albertans and Her Majesty. God save the King.
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is always an honor to rise and speak in this House. It is especially so today to speak in support of this motion, Government Motion 32. Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was an ever-present force of stability and tradition in our nation. Mr. Speaker, the day was June 30th, 1990. My family and I, along with my grandpa and grandma Craig, went to Calgary to see the Queen inspect her 2 regiments there, of which she, the Queen, was Colonel-in-Chief. They were the King's Own Calgary Regiment and the Calgary Highlanders. There, she presented the Calgary Highlanders with their new colors. The Highlanders, I believe, were actually the last Canadian regiment to change their colors from the Union Jack to the Canadian flag. And this, of course, was the ceremony to do just that. My Grandpa Craig, marched in that ceremony with the King's Own Calgary Regiment, to which the reserve unit in Red Deer was attached, and my grandpa remained in the reserves after World War II. He was there, I believe, as a medical officer. My grandpa actually said several times, with amazement in his voice, that the Queen walked within 3 feet of where he was marching. However, I remember sitting up in the stands at McMahon Stadium, and of course, as a 10-year-old boy, spotting and pointing out my grandpa, and of course, watching the Queen with admiration, surrounded by family at such a special event. These are great memories that I have not thought about for years. So, in somewhat odd fashion, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Her late Majesty for reminding me of these cherished memories of time with my family and my grandparents. Her late Majesty, of course, again visited in 2005. I also, though, had the opportunity, as was previously mentioned, when she opened the games in Victoria in 1994, I got to see her there as well. However, I would just say that Her late Majesty's presence is felt in many ways, sometimes through personal memories and stories and such as what I shared, and then also sometimes through the buildings, roads, parks, and of course pathways that bear her name throughout Alberta. Albertans and their families experience and enjoy these sites every single day. On that note, as we heard from the Premier, our government will be honoring Her late Majesty by renaming one of the buildings here on the Legislature grounds. The federal building will soon be officially recognized as Queen Elizabeth II building, and I am honored to play a small role in that process through my ministry. Madam Speaker, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of other colleagues in this legislature, but I am certain we all join His Majesty the King in solidarity, expressing our deepest sympathy for his loss. Her late Majesty's contributions to this province and of course to our nation are immeasurable, and her memory will be an eternal one. So again, thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to speak, and of course, God save the King.
The Honourable Member for West Yellowhead.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is an honour and a privilege to say a few words today in remembrance of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen and the royal family have always had a special place in my heart. Growing up, I was fortunate to have a grandmother who was an avid monarchist, who collected every picture, magazine, postcard, and newspaper featuring the royal family. And so for me, from a young age, the Queen wasn't simply a symbol or a person. Because of the Queen, I was able to have a special connection with my grandmother as she revealed her memorabilia to me whenever I would visit. You know, my grandmother would actually have a birthday cake for me whenever I visited her as a child, no matter what time of year it was or how far away my birthday was. And it was sort of awkward because I remember visiting my grandparents in December, Christmas time, and I have 3 siblings who all were born in December, and yet my grandmother would have a birthday cake for me because I was somewhat special to my grandmother. I never got confirmation about why that was or why my grandmother would call me and not my siblings to wish me a happy birthday, but I do suspect that it was because I shared a birthday with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, August 4th. You know, one of my fondest childhood memories is actually watching with my parents when the then Prince Charles and Princess Diana drove past us in a red convertible on a visit to Nova Scotia. I was 5 years old at the time. I was much too small, much too short to see past the massive crowds that had formed. But my dad told me if I wanted to see Princess Diana, that I would have to stand up on his shoulders. And I was a little bit scared of such a thing, but he's like, the only way you can see them is if you stand on my shoulders. So he hoisted me up, and I stood on his shoulders, and he had a hold of my feet and told me to stop shaking so I wouldn't fall. But again, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity as a small child to see the royals drive by. Later in my life, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the United Kingdom, and with my royal family connection just ingrained in me since a child, it was natural to be huddled by the fire on a blustery Christmas day in Scotland with a priority to watch the Queen's Christmas Day address. Now, when I think of Her Majesty, the one word that comes to mind above all else is service. You know, as we know, on her 21st birthday, when she famously declared, "My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be dedicated to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." You know, those are words that we can all hope to aspire to as we serve Albertans. But you know, her life of service did start before that, when she served in World War II as the first female member of the royal family to serve in uniform full-time. Over the course of her life and her reign as queen, she lived up to and exceeded her 1947 declaration of service, dedicating her life to the service of Britain, the Commonwealth, and indeed the world. Throughout her life, Her Majesty demonstrated her affinity for our province, visiting Alberta 5 times as queen and once as princess. Her love of our province and people is matched by the love that Albertans have for her. She personified the ideals of dignity, grace, decency, and humanity that we all strive to emulate. So for many of us, she was a symbol of stability in an ever-changing and often uncertain world. For most of us, she was the only monarch we ever knew. I think the reason my grandmother, and so many around the world loved her so is because she wasn't just a queen. In her, we saw a mother, a grandmother, a sister. She played all of these roles and more, not just in her own family, but to us all. We could all relate to her as if she was family, and in this way, she was. And so she will be remembered by us all for being the great queen that she was, yes, but just as much, if not more, for the great person that she was. Although her life was long and fulfilling, I know that I am not alone in wishing it was just a little bit longer. May Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II rest in peace and glory. Long live the King.
The Associate Minister of the Status of Women.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to join my fellow Albertans and people across the Commonwealth in mourning the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Throughout her life, Her Majesty provided courageous leadership and diplomacy as an exemplary female head of state to Canada and the 55 other member states of the Commonwealth. During her remarkable 70-year reign, she was a constant in an ever-changing world and the only monarch most of us have ever known. As a child, I was privileged to meet Her Majesty, the Queen, and His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, as they toured my constituency of Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville on August the 2nd of 1978. It was a special day that I will always remember. Being in awe of her natural beauty and extreme kindness, I remember she wore an emerald green dress and a hat, which made her look very regal. I also remember that many of us were extending our hands out to her. She did not reach out to all, but she did take the time to say hello to myself and a few of my young friends. Throughout her reign, Her Majesty the Queen has been a role model for young women in leadership since her coronation at the age of 27. I take great inspiration from her as Alberta's Associate Minister for the Status of Women. Her Majesty has exemplified diplomacy, wise counsel, and unfailing public service. She has surpassed barriers and preconceived notions of what it means to be a woman in leadership throughout her entire life. On her 18th birthday in 1944, Princess Elizabeth, as she was then known, insisted upon joining the army, where she volunteered as a truck driver and a mechanic during the Second World War. She provided wise counsel to 15 prime ministers of the United Kingdom, 13 male and 2 female, including the incoming UK Prime Minister Liz Truss, meeting with each prime minister on a weekly basis to discuss state matters. She had been the head of the worldwide Anglican Communion and the Church of England for decades before female priests and bishops were officially recognized in these churches. In addition to being the longest-serving British monarch, Her Majesty was also married for over 73 years, wow, and the greatest length of time of any British sovereign. She married her much-loved husband, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, on November 20, 1947, and they remained devoted to each other throughout their lives. The Duke of Edinburgh passed away in April of 2021 after 73 years of marriage to Her Majesty. We can now take solace that they have been reunited. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth will always be remembered in our hearts as the epitome of a slogan made popular while she was serving in the Second World War: keep calm and carry on. Thank you, Your Majesty, for your incredible 70 years of service and devotion to Canada and the Commonwealth. We will do our best to live up to the example of servant leadership that you have provided for us all. May you rest in peace, Your Majesty. May God bless His Majesty King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, along with the Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Catherine, as they begin their new roles. God save the King.
The Honourable Member for Drayton Valley, Devon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is with great sadness I stand to speak to Motion 32 today. In our Confederation of Provinces, we have inherited a democratic government where the power of government is established in a constitutional monarchy. As a high school teacher, I would often have students who had never been taught that the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II in my classroom was not the portrait of a foreign monarch, but that of the Queen of Canada. I would try and help them understand why in Canada we continue to have a monarch, the value of having the Queen as our head of state. I would point out how she and her representatives, the Governor General and Lieutenant Governors, could, in a nonpartisan fashion, represent the Government of Canada, the provinces, and therefore all Canadians, regardless of political inclination or loyalty. The long and often proud history of our ties to Great Britain were embedded in our relationship to the Crown. I would try and help my students to understand that the Queen, while a figurehead as far as the real exercise of political power, was nonetheless a binding influence in our country, one that provided a very strong and real sense of stability in our nation, where sometimes geography and language and culture and religion could stress the bonds of unity. I'm old enough to remember the Union Jack flying from every school and government building in this province and country. And I remember Dominion Day as a child, rather than Canada Day. I remember singing God Save the Queen in school and at Cub Scouts. And I remember burying my grandfather, a Canadian and World War II veteran, with his flag of choice draped over his coffin. That flag, the Union Jack. I've always believed that while all of the political benefits of being a constitutional monarchy had merit, it was the Queen herself and the way that she acquitted herself as our monarch that spoke the loudest as to why we should support this ancient institution in our very young country. And it was her long reign, characterized by her devoted service to the Commonwealth and her subjects in Canada, that made her more than just our monarch, but someone that we loved and could admire. For this Canadian, I found it almost impossible to comprehend how she crafted an ancient institution based on a power imbalance of monarch and subject into a modern dynamic institution based on a servant leadership relationship with her government and her people. With every visit to Canada, she showed us that we could be proud of her and the institution that she represented. We were a monarchy. And with every visit to Canada and to Alberta, and indeed to this very chamber, she reminded us of her grace and dignity as our monarch and her very real humanity. With every walkabout, with every flash of wit, with every visit to a farm, or every time she opened up a ceremony, she reminded us that underneath the long history and tradition of being a queen, she was also a mother, a wife, a real person who also had to face the everyday struggles and disappointments that come with a long life. She was our monarch, and she was also one of us. The Queen has passed. Her long and distinguished reign is over, but there is still comfort in being able to pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth II, and then with heartfelt gratitude, repeat what has been said before over the many years of our democratic history as a constitutional monarchy. God save the King. Thank you.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Calgary-Falconridge.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak and commemorate the life of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. My colleagues have already spoken some wonderful and heartfelt words about the Queen. I would like to use this opportunity to reflect on Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee, which we just celebrated in this chamber last June. This year, Her late Majesty became the first British monarch to celebrate a Platinum Jubilee after 70 years of service. If you stop and think about it, 70 years is an immense amount of time. She has seen the world go through technological changes, political changes, and social changes. We celebrated her then for years of service and steady presence through those times of change. We celebrate her now for those same reasons and the life she lived. She celebrated her Silver Jubilee in 1977 and Golden Jubilee in 2002. It was during her Golden Jubilee celebrations
that she made it clear that she was the sovereign for all her people and that for our different religions. This shows that God's love, it stands the equal measures to the whole humanity. A resonant echo of Sikh teachings that shows the important commonalities between our different faiths. Dedication to duty and respecting others are the fundamental values of the Sikh community. She made everyone she met feel comfortable and respected. She was beloved throughout the world, and that was certainly the case right here in Canada and Alberta. She visited our beautiful province 6 times, 5 times as a queen, once as a princess. She even honored this very chamber with her presence in 2005, the first time Iranian monarch had visited our legislature. Her late Majesty was dedicated sovereign who helped shape our history during her 70 years on the throne. She was our longest-serving monarch. I hope that Albertans find some time on this mourning period to commemorate the remarkable life of Queen Elizabeth II and her long and dedicated service to the Commonwealth. Time to rest now, ma'am. Thank you for everything.
The Honourable Member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today with a heavy heart and with the utmost respect and reverence to remember the late Queen Elizabeth II. Growing up, I remember dreaming of princesses and royalty like most little girls do, and because of that, I developed a deep fondness for the royal family. Although as a little girl I'd never been to the United Kingdom, I felt a sense of connection to the late Her Majesty and felt an affinity for her that I haven't ever felt for the likes of any celebrity or any public figure. Her regality was unreal to a young girl from Medicine Hat whose only crown was made of plastic, yet she was as real as anyone could be, close in our minds and hearts, yet thousands of kilometers away. It was not until I sat down to collect my thoughts today that I really understood the magnitude of what she gave of herself to us. We in this place as public office holders and MLAs pledged our service to Her Majesty to serve faithfully and dutifully. It's a large contract undertaking, a contract that must be entered into with respect for those you serve and a reverence to make decisions prudently. I took that oath in 2019 at the age of 25. In contrast, at just 25 years old, Her Majesty took on a duty that not even she expected to take, the consequences of which not one of us could ever fathom. She pledged her life and all she was and was to become in service to us for 70 years. In a touching tribute by the Right Honourable Boris Johnson, she was referred to as a changeless human reference point, and I think that sums her up quite well. Through global chaos, turmoil, changes in government, changes in lifestyle, politics, fashion, and everything else in between, she was constant. She remained in her perfect way the picture of elegance, a personification of grace, and an embodiment of almost omnipotence, one that I fear our world will never see again. What is truly astounding is that in all of this pomp and circumstance, in her regality and effervescence, she maintained a sense of relatability with even the least of those that she served. On the day of her passing, snippets of her sense of humor and wit were shared across social media platforms. And whether it was jumping out of a helicopter with James Bond, or cutting a cake with a sword, or sharing a marmalade sandwich with Paddington Bear, that one always seems to get me. Seemingly small, trivial endeavors in the grand picture of her reign, she endeared herself to us all. Her stable and enduring presence was a testament to her deep and abiding faith. One of my more favorite quotes from the late Her Majesty is when she said that each day is a new beginning. I know that the only way to live my life is to try to do what's right, to take the long view, to give the best in all that the day brings, and to put my trust in God. I believe that all of us, Christian or not, can relate to that and uphold those values. As we reflect on the life and reign of Her Majesty and welcome in a new era with King Charles III, we do so with the knowledge that her remarkable life of public service and dedication to country has left an impact. As the longest reigning monarch, Canada's queen, my queen, We are learning the lesson that she so eloquently taught us. Grief truly is the price that we pay for love. May God bless the royal family at this time, bring comfort to all that she served, and may God save the King. Long live the King. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Assigned seats. Visitors to speak to Government Motion 32, the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What do you say to honour someone who has given so much to her country, to the Commonwealth, and to the whole world? A life of self-service and sacrifice should always be remembered. Queen Elizabeth II was a role model to so many. As a woman of faith, integrity, and quiet dignity, she was a steadfast leader. I trust that much will be written and said about such a noteworthy person. But for now, I just want to say thank you, O good and faithful servant of the people. May you rest in peace, and may God bless your son, the King.
Are there others? Seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, on Government Motion 32, the humble address to be presented to His Majesty the King. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, well, absolutely, that deserved a round of applause. I'm sorry I interrupted that. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and through you to all members of the Assembly from all parties for taking the time today to come back to Edmonton. This was a very historical moment, and I appreciate everybody's efforts. And I hope you all travel back safely to your constituencies. And as such, Mr. Speaker, I will move that the Legislative Assembly will adjourn until Monday, October 31st, 2022.
Honourable members, all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. The House stands adjourned.